Picture this. It's a scorching day in May, 1274 BCE. The sun beats down mercilessly on the plains near the ancient city of Kadesh, in what is now modern-day Syria. The air itself seems to tremble with anticipation, and then you hear it. The thunder, not from the skies, but from the earth itself. The ground begins to shake beneath your feet. A low rumble grows louder, building into a cacophony that drowns out all thought. It's the sound of 5,000 to 6,000 chariots, their wheels churning up clouds of dust that darken the sky like an approaching sandstorm. Bronze weapons glint in the sunlight. War cries in a dozen different languages pierce the air. Horses scream, warriors roar. This is the Battle of Kadesh. This is the largest chariot battle ever fought in human history. Two empires, two legendary rulers, 20,000 soldiers on each side, and a conflict that would forever change the course of ancient history, culminating in the world's first recorded international peace treaty. Welcome to a journey back in time, to an era when bronze gleamed sharper than steel, when gods walked alongside mortals on the battlefield, and when the fate of civilizations was decided not by diplomacy or negotiation, but by the thundering charge of war chariots across blood-soaked earth. I'm going to take you through every dramatic moment of this epic confrontation. We'll explore the political tensions that led to war. We'll examine the innovative military technologies that made this battle possible. We'll walk alongside Pharaoh Ramesses II as he faces near certain death, surrounded by enemies. And we'll witness how this brutal stalemate, paradoxically, gave birth to one of history's greatest diplomatic achievements. This is more than just a story about ancient warfare. It's a story about ambition, deception, courage, survival, and ultimately, the wisdom to choose peace over endless conflict. So settle in, because we're about to embark on a 3,000-year journey to the blood-drenched plains of Kadesh. Part 1. The stage is set, the world of the late Bronze Age. The superpowers of the 13th century BCE. To understand the Battle of Kadesh, we must first understand the world in which it took place. The 13th century BCE was a time of great empires and sophisticated civilizations. This was the late Bronze Age, an era that saw remarkable achievements in art, architecture, diplomacy, and warfare. The Eastern Mediterranean and Near East were dominated by several major powers, but two stood head and shoulders above the rest: the Egyptian Empire of the New Kingdom and the Hittite Empire of Anatolia. Egypt, under the 19th dynasty, was experiencing what many historians consider its final golden age. The land of the Nile had shaken off the religious upheaval of Akhenaten's reign and the brief restoration under Tutankhamun. Now, under the leadership of Seti I and his son Ramesses II, Egypt was reasserting its dominance over territories it had once controlled in Canaan and Syria. The Egyptian Empire stretched from Nubia in the south to the borders of Syria in the north. Its wealth was legendary. Gold flowed from Nubian mines. Grain from the fertile Nile Delta fed millions. The temples of Karnak and Luxor stood as monuments to Egyptian power and piety. Egyptian scribes had perfected one of the world's most sophisticated writing systems. Egyptian artists created works of breathtaking beauty that still astound us today. But Egypt was not alone in its glory. Far to the north, in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, the Hittite Empire had risen to rival Egypt's power and prestige. The Hittites had burst onto the international scene dramatically in 1595 BCE, when King Muwatalli I led a daring raid down the Euphrates River to sack Babylon itself, one of the ancient world's greatest cities. Though Muwatalli was assassinated before he could consolidate these gains, the message was clear: a new power had arrived. By the 13th century BCE, under rulers like Suppiluliuma I and his descendants, the Hittites controlled vast territories. Their empire, encompassed most of modern-day Turkey, significant portions of Syria, and extended its influence into northern Mesopotamia. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, was a marvel of Bronze Age engineering, with its massive stone walls and sophisticated water systems. The Hittites were innovators. They were among the first to master iron working, though this technology was still in its infancy and not yet widespread. They developed advanced diplomatic practices, maintaining a vast archive of treaties and correspondence with other powers. And critically for our story, they perfected the heavy three-man war chariot, a weapon that would prove devastatingly effective on the battlefield. Between these two giants lay the region we now call the Levant, encompassing modern-day Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and parts of Syria. This area was the crossroads of the ancient world. Trade routes connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe passed through these lands. Cities like Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, and Damascus grew wealthy from commerce. And crucially, whoever controlled the Levant controlled access to valuable resources, trade revenues, and strategic positions. This was the prize both Egypt and the Hittites coveted. And the city of Kadesh, located on the Orontes River in modern Syria, was the key to it all. The strategic jewel. Kadesh was not just any city. Its position made it invaluable. Located on the Orontes River, just upstream from Lake Homs near what is now the Syria-Lebanon border, Kadesh sat at the intersection of several major trade routes. Caravans traveling between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean coast passed through or near Kadesh. Merchants moving between Anatolia and Egypt used routes that ran past its walls. Control of Kadesh meant control of commerce, taxation, and military movement throughout the region. But Kadesh's value went beyond economics. It was also a symbol. Throughout the late Bronze Age, Kadesh had changed hands multiple times. Egyptian pharaohs had fought to control it. Hittite kings had claimed it as their own. Local dynasties had declared their independence when the great powers weakened. The city had witnessed some of the most famous battles of the ancient world, including the Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BCE, where Pharaoh Thutmose III had won a spectacular victory against a coalition of Syrian princes led by the king of Kadesh. By the time Ramesses II came to power, Kadesh was firmly under Hittite control. The Hittite king, Muwatalli II, had fortified the city and installed loyal vassals to govern it. For Egypt, this was intolerable. Kadesh had once been Egyptian territory. Its loss represented a diminishment of Egyptian power and prestige. If Egypt was to be taken seriously as a great power, if Ramesses II was to live up to the legacy of warrior pharaohs like Thutmose III, then Kadesh had to be recaptured. But there was more at stake than just Kadesh itself. The city's control also meant control over the kingdom of Amurru, a small but strategically important state on the Mediterranean coast. Amurru had been an Egyptian vassal, but it had switched allegiance to the Hittites during the religious turmoil of Akhenaten's reign. This betrayal still rankled the Egyptian court. Recapturing Kadesh would not only restore Egyptian prestige, but also potentially bring Amurru back into the Egyptian sphere of influence. The stage was set for conflict. Two empires, both powerful, both proud, both convinced of their divine right to rule. A strategic city that neither could afford to lose, and two young, ambitious rulers, each determined to prove himself worthy of his throne. War was inevitable. Ramesses II, the young pharaoh's ambition. Ramesses II, known to history as Ramesses the Great, came to the throne of Egypt in 1279 BCE at approximately 25 years old. He was young, energetic, and acutely aware that he had enormous shoes to fill. His father, Seti I, had been a formidable warrior king. Seti had campaigned extensively in Canaan and Syria, even capturing Kadesh briefly before being forced to cede it back to the Hittites in a peace agreement. Young Ramesses had accompanied his father on these campaigns, learning the art of war firsthand. He had seen the temples his father had built, monuments proclaiming Seti's victories. He had witnessed the respect accorded to successful warrior pharaohs. Ramesses was determined to equal, even surpass, his father's achievements. But Ramesses was more than just a warrior. He was also a masterful propagandist and a shrewd politician. He understood that in ancient Egypt, a pharaoh's power rested not just on military might, but on perceived divine favor. The pharaoh was not merely a king. He was the living embodiment of the god Horus, the son of Ra, the intermediary between the gods and humanity. Every action a pharaoh took, every monument he built, every victory he won was presented as proof of divine support. Ramesses excelled at self-promotion. Throughout his 67-year reign, he would commission more monuments, statues, and temples than any other pharaoh in Egyptian history. His name appears on virtually every major ancient Egyptian site. He was a master of what we would today call personal branding, and the Battle of Kadesh would become the centerpiece of his propaganda campaign, depicted on temple walls from Egypt to Nubia, described in epic poems that schoolboys would copy for generations. But in 1274 BCE, Ramesses was still early in his reign. He had victories to win, a reputation to establish, and a legacy to build. His eye turned northward, to Syria, to the wealthy trade routes, and to Kadesh, the city his father had briefly held, before losing it again to the Hittites. Ramesses began his preparations. Muwatalli II, the Hittite defender, facing Ramesses across the battlefield, would be Muwatalli II, king of the Hittites. Muwatalli had come to power around 1295 BCE, making him a more experienced ruler than his Egyptian counterpart. Like Ramesses, Muwatalli was the son of a great warrior king. His father, Mursili II, had been one of the most successful Hittite rulers, expanding the empire's borders and crushing rebellions with ruthless efficiency. But Muwatalli faced challenges that Ramesses did not. The Hittite Empire, while powerful, was more fragile than Egypt. Unlike Egypt, which was geographically protected by deserts to the east and west, the Hittite heartland in Anatolia was surrounded by potential enemies. To the north, the fierce Kaska tribes constantly raided Hittite territory. To the east, the rising Assyrian Empire posed an increasing threat, and to the south, Egyptian ambitions threatened Hittite control of Syria. Muwatalli could not afford to lose Kadesh. The city represented the southern anchor of Hittite power in Syria. Its loss would not only mean the loss of valuable trade revenue, but could also trigger a cascade of defections among Hittite vassals in the region. If Kadesh fell, other Syrian cities might switch their allegiance to Egypt, sensing that the Hittite star was waning. The entire Hittite position in Syria could collapse. Muwatalli was a strategic thinker. He understood that this coming conflict with Egypt would not be just another border skirmish. It would be a decisive test of Hittite power. He began making preparations of his own, calling up troops from across the empire, reaching out to allies, and positioning his forces to defend Kadesh against the inevitable Egyptian assault. What neither ruler fully understood was just how closely matched they would prove to be, and how the battle they were about to fight would become legendary, not for producing a clear victor, but for demonstrating the futility of continued warfare and the necessity of peace. Part 2. Armies of the Bronze Age. The military machine. The Egyptian war machine. To appreciate the scale and drama of the Battle of Kadesh, we need to understand the armies that fought it. Let's begin with the Egyptian military, one of the most sophisticated fighting forces of the ancient world. By the time of Ramesses II, the Egyptian army had evolved considerably from its origins. During the Old and Middle Kingdoms, Egypt had relied primarily on militia lines, temporary armies raised for specific campaigns, and then disbanded. But the traumatic experience of the Hyksos invasion during the Second Intermediate Period, when foreign rulers conquered and occupied Egypt for over a century, had taught the Egyptians hard lessons about military preparedness. The New Kingdom army was a professional force, at least in its core units. While conscripts and militia still played a role, the backbone of Egyptian military power consisted of career soldiers who trained regularly and served in permanent units. These professional soldiers were supplemented by foreign mercenaries, particularly Nubians from the south and, increasingly, Mediterranean peoples like the Chariot, who appear at Kadesh fighting for Egypt. Egyptian military organization was sophisticated. The army was divided into divisions, each numbering around 5,000 men. These divisions were named after major Egyptian deities: Amun, Re sometimes spelled Ra or Pre, Ptah, and Seth. This religious naming wasn't just ceremonial. It reflected the Egyptian belief that the gods themselves fought alongside their mortal worshippers. Each division had its own commander, its own support staff, and its own sacred standard that served as a rallying point in battle. Within each division, troops were organized into smaller units. The basic tactical unit was probably around 50 men, though our evidence for Egyptian unit organization is frustratingly incomplete. These units could be deployed flexibly, either as tight formations of spearmen or more open skirmish lines of archers. The Egyptian soldier was well equipped by Bronze Age standards. Infantry carried a variety of weapons. The khopesh, a distinctive sickle-shaped bronze sword, was effective for slashing attacks. Bronze-tipped spears and javelins provided reach. Wooden shields, often covered with leather, offered protection. More elite troops might wear bronze armor, though this was expensive and not universal. Archers were a crucial component of Egyptian armies. The composite bow, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, could launch arrows with deadly force and accuracy over considerable distances. Egyptian archers trained extensively, and their skill was renowned throughout the ancient world. But the true striking power of the New Kingdom Egyptian army lay in its chariotry. The Egyptian chariot, speed and precision. The chariot had transformed warfare in the ancient Near East. Introduced to Egypt during the Hyksos period, the Egyptians had not merely adopted this technology, they had perfected it. The Egyptian war chariot was a marvel of engineering. Unlike the heavy, cumbersome vehicles of earlier periods, the Egyptian chariot was designed for speed and maneuverability. The chassis was made of lightweight wood, often acacia or tamarisk, carefully shaped and joined. The floor was typically constructed from woven leather strips, which provided both flexibility and shock absorption. This suspension system, crude by modern standards but ingenious for the Bronze Age, allowed the chariot to travel quickly over rough terrain without jarring its crew too severely. The wheels were critical. Egyptian chariots featured spoked wheels, another innovation that reduced weight while maintaining strength. Typically, each wheel had 4 or 6 spokes radiating from a central hub. The rim was often covered with leather for better traction and to reduce wear. The axle was positioned at the rear of the chariot chassis, which improved stability and made the vehicle easier to control at high speeds. The Egyptian chariot crew consisted of 2 men, a driver and a warrior, typically an archer. The driver controlled the 2-horse team using reins and, when necessary, a whip or goad. His job was to position the chariot for optimal combat effectiveness while avoiding enemy fire and obstacles. This required incredible skill and bravery. The warrior, meanwhile, was free to concentrate on combat, using his composite bow to rain arrows on the enemy, or, in close combat, switching to javelins or even a spear. This 2-man crew arrangement gave Egyptian chariots a significant advantage in mobility. Being lighter than their Hittite counterparts, Egyptian chariots could accelerate faster, turn more sharply, and maintain higher speeds for longer periods. They were, in essence, mobile firing platforms. designed to harass enemy formations with archery rather than crash into enemy planes. Chariot warfare required extensive training. Horses had to be carefully bred and conditioned for the rigors of battle. Young horses underwent lengthy training programs to accustom them to the chaos of combat, the noise, the smoke, the smell of blood. Chariot crews practiced maneuvers constantly, learning to operate as seamless teams. The driver and warrior had to trust each other implicitly. Any hesitation or miscommunication could be fatal. Chariots were expensive. Each vehicle represented a significant investment in materials and skilled labor. The horses required constant care, feeding, and training. Only wealthy individuals or the state could afford to maintain chariot forces. As a result, chariot warriors formed an elite class in Egyptian society, accorded high status and privileges. For the Kadesh campaign, Ramesses II assembled approximately 2,000 chariots distributed among his 4 divisions. This represented one of the largest chariot forces Egypt had ever fielded. Each division had roughly 500 chariots, along with about 4,500 infantry. The total Egyptian force that marched north toward Kadesh numbered around 20,000 men and 2,000 chariots. But there was one more element to Ramesses' army, a somewhat mysterious force that would play a crucial role in the battle: the Nearin, the mysterious Nearin. The Nearin remain one of the more puzzling aspects of the Battle of Kadesh. Egyptian records mention them, but their exact nature is unclear. The name itself may derive from a Canaanite or Semitic root, meaning young men or warriors. Most historians believe the Nearin were either Canaanite mercenaries hired by Egypt, or possibly an elite Egyptian unit that had been stationed in Amuru to secure the port of Sumur on the Mediterranean coast. They may have been kept separate from the main 4 divisions, which could explain why they're listed separately in Egyptian accounts. What we know for certain is that the Nearin arrived at a critical moment during the Battle of Kadesh, approaching from the north rather than from the south with the main Egyptian army. Their timely arrival would help save Ramesses from disaster. Whether their appearance was planned or fortuitous is still debated by scholars, but their impact on the battle's outcome was undeniable. The Egyptian army that marched toward Kadesh in the spring of 1274 BCE was formidable, well-organized, well-equipped, and led by an ambitious young pharaoh determined to prove himself. But they would face an enemy equally prepared, equally determined, and commanding weapons and tactics that would test the Egyptians to their limits: the Hittite war machine. If the Egyptian army represented sophistication and mobility, the Hittite army exemplified power and diversity. The Hittite Empire was, in many ways, more complex than Egypt, where Egypt was largely homogeneous, with a single dominant culture and language. The Hittite Empire was a patchwork of different peoples, cultures, and languages, all held together by Hittite military might and diplomatic skill. This diversity was reflected in the Hittite army, which was one of the most cosmopolitan forces of the ancient world. For the Kadesh campaign, King Muwatalli II assembled an enormous army. Egyptian records, admittedly prone to exaggeration when describing enemy forces, claim that the Hittites fielded around 37,000 infantry and 3,500 chariots. Modern historians generally consider these numbers inflated, but not impossibly so. The Hittite force at Kadesh probably numbered between 20 and 40,000 men, with the chariot force likely in the range of 2,500 to 3,500 vehicles. What made the Hittite army unique was its composition. Muwatalli had called upon his vassals and allies throughout the empire. Egyptian inscriptions at Karnak list 19 different Hittite allies who contributed troops to the battle. These included forces from Aleppo, Carchemish, Ugarit, the remnants of the Mitanni kingdom, Arzawa, Massa, Pitasa, and even possibly Wilusa, which some scholars identify with the legendary city of Troy. This coalition army presented both strengths and challenges for Muwatalli. On one hand, it allowed him to field a massive force, larger than the Hittites alone could have mustered. On the other hand, it created command and control difficulties. Different contingents spoke different languages, used different tactics, and had varying levels of training and equipment. Coordinating such a diverse force would test Muwatalli's abilities as a commander. Hittite infantry were formidable fighters. They typically fought in dense formations, armed with spears, swords, and shields. The Khopesh-style sickle sword was popular among Hittite warriors, as were bronze-headed spears that could be used for both thrusting and throwing. Some troops carried large rectangular shields that could be locked together to form a shield wall, providing protection against enemy archery. But as with the Egyptians, the true striking power of the Hittite army lay in its chariotry. And here, the Hittites had developed something quite different from their Egyptian counterparts, the Hittite chariot, the heavy striker. The Hittite war chariot represented a different tactical philosophy than the Egyptian design. Where Egyptian chariots prioritized speed and mobility, Hittite chariots emphasized power and shock value. The Hittite chariot was larger and heavier than its Egyptian equivalent. Its chassis was more robust, built to withstand the stresses of close combat. Most distinctively, the Hittite chariot carried a crew of 3 men instead of 2. This third crew member made all the difference. The Hittite chariot crew consisted of a driver, a warrior armed with a spear or lance, and a shield bearer. The driver controlled the horses and maneuvered the chariot. The warrior engaged the enemy with his long spear, or in some cases, a bow. And the shield bearer, who stood or was tethered at the back of the chariot, protected both his companions with a large shield while also providing additional stability during tight maneuvers. The advantage of this 3-man arrangement was significant. While Egyptian chariots had to choose between mobility and close combat capability, Hittite chariots could do both. The shield bearer's presence meant the warrior could fight with both hands on his spear or lance, delivering powerful thrusting attacks without worrying about defense. When engaging enemy chariots, the Hittites could close to spear range, where their heavier vehicles and longer weapons gave them a decisive advantage. The Hittite chariot's design also differed in its axle placement. Unlike Egyptian chariots, which positioned the axle at the rear of the chassis, Hittite chariots placed the axle in the center. This central axle position, combined with the larger chassis, provided greater stability, especially when carrying 3 men. It made the chariot less likely to tip over during sharp turns and allowed it to navigate the rougher terrain common in Anatolia and northern Syria. However, these advantages came at a cost. The Hittite chariot was significantly heavier than its Egyptian counterpart, which meant it was slower and less maneuverable. In a running battle or pursuit, Egyptian chariots could outpace Hittite ones. The heavier Hittite design also required stronger, more robust horses and placed greater strain on both the animals and the vehicle components. Hittite chariot tactics reflected these design differences. Rather than engaging in mobile archery duels, Hittite chariots were designed for shock attacks. They would mass together in large formations, then charge enemy positions, using their weight and the reach of their spears to break through enemy lines. Once they had disrupted an enemy formation, Hittite infantry would exploit the breach. The horses pulling Hittite chariots were carefully bred and trained. A remarkable text discovered at the Hittite capital Hattusa provides detailed instructions for horse training, written by a man named Kikuli, described as a horse trainer from the land of Mitanni. This text, which dates to the 13th century BCE, outlines a rigorous 184-day training program for chariot horses beginning in autumn and involving carefully calibrated exercises to build the animal's stamina and prevent injury. The level of detail in this document reveals the sophistication of Hittite, or in this case, Mitannian, horse training, and the value placed on these animals. For the Kadesh campaign, Muwatalli assembled what may have been the largest chariot force in Hittite history. The exact number is disputed, but it likely exceeded 2,500 vehicles and may have approached 3,500. When combined with the Egyptian chariot force, the Battle of Kadesh would involve somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 chariots, making it the largest chariot battle in recorded history. But Muwatalli faced a problem: money, the cost of war. Raising such an enormous army had depleted Hittite coffers. Many of the allied contingents expected to be paid for their service.
We will crush
but
the Egyptians today.
had run out of funds.
Kadesh will be ours,
He made a
and their
fateful
wealth
decision.
will flow into
He
your
promised
hands.
his troops
Prepare
that they
for
could
glory.
plunder the defeated Egyptians. In lieu of regular payment, his soldiers would be compensated with whatever they could take from Egyptian dead and prisoners.
There they
This
are,
decision
Pharaoh's
would have
finest.
profound
Take
consequences
Kadesh
during
and
the battle.
crush them.
It created a powerful incentive for Hittite troops to stop and loot once they gained the upper hand. But it also meant that if the tide of battle turned, Muwatalli would have difficulty rallying troops who were busy plundering rather than fighting. Still, as both armies converged on Kadesh in the spring of 1274 BCE, Muwatalli had reason for confidence. He had assembled a massive force. He had chosen excellent defensive ground. And he had a plan to trap and destroy the Egyptian army through deception and ambush. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic battles of the ancient world. Part 3, The March to Destiny, Prelude to Battle. The Egyptian Advance. In the spring of 1274 BCE, the 5th year of his reign, Ramesses II departed from his capital at Ramesses in the eastern Nile Delta. The Egyptian war machine was in motion. The army moved in stages, a carefully orchestrated logistical operation. First came the Amun division, led by Ramesses himself. This was the premier division of the Egyptian army, bearing the name of Egypt's king of the gods. Behind them, at intervals, came the Re division, then Ptah, and finally Seth. Each division traveled separately, a practical necessity given the size of the army. Why travel separately? The answer lies in logistics. An army of 20,000 men and 2,000 chariots, along with all their support personnel and animals, represented an enormous concentration of people and animals. If they all traveled together in one massive column, they would quickly exhaust local food supplies. Foraging would become impossible as the surrounding countryside was stripped bare. By traveling in separate divisions, spaced perhaps a day's march apart, the army could live off the land more effectively, supplementing their supplies with whatever food and fodder could be gathered along the route. The march followed a well-established route. From Ramesses, the army moved to the fortress of Tiaru on Egypt's northeastern border, the starting point of the Horus military road that connected Egypt to Canaan. This route ran along the Mediterranean coast through Gaza and up into Canaan. It was the same route that Egyptian armies had used for centuries, well supplied with forts and water sources. As the army marched, Ramesses must have felt confident. He commanded a powerful force. His soldiers were well trained. His chariots were superior in mobility to anything the Hittites could field, and he had the advantage of interior lines, allowing him to mass his forces while the Hittites had to gather contingents from across their empire. But Ramesses also knew that his father, Seti I, had captured Kadesh only to lose it again. The Hittites were formidable opponents. They had crushed the kingdom of Mitanni, once Egypt's chief rival in Syria. They had held off Assyrian expansion. Their army was renowned for its fighting prowess. Still, Ramesses had youth, ambition, and confidence on his side. He was determined not to repeat his father's incomplete success. This time, Egypt would reclaim Kadesh permanently. The march continued northward through Canaan and into Syria. Somewhere along the route, the Naaran force split off, possibly to approach Kadesh from the north via the port of Sumer on the coast, though exactly when and why this happened remains unclear. As the Egyptian divisions approached Kadesh, Ramesses pushed ahead with the Amun division, eager to reach the city and begin operations. This decision to increase the pace and widen the gap between divisions would prove nearly fatal. The Hittite trap. While the Egyptians marched north, Muwatalli was preparing his defense. The Hittite king had assembled his enormous coalition army and positioned them strategically near Kadesh, but he didn't deploy them in place. in sight. Instead, Muwatalli hid the bulk of his forces behind the ancient city, using Kadesh itself as a screen. The Egyptians approaching from the south and west would not be able to see the Hittite army until it was too late. This was a sophisticated piece of battlefield deception, requiring careful coordination and discipline. Muwatalli had to keep thousands of men and thousands of chariots concealed and quiet, despite the dust, noise, and movement such a large force inevitably generated. The Hittites positioned themselves east and northeast of Kadesh, behind the city and concealed by its walls and buildings. But Muwatalli didn't rely solely on concealment. He also employed active deception. As the Egyptian Amun division approached Kadesh, Ramesses' scouts captured 2 Bedouins who claimed to be deserters from the Hittite army.
The enemy is far
When
to the
interrogated,
north, near Aleppo.
these men told Ramesses exactly
fear.
what he wanted to hear. The Hittite army was far to the north, near the city of Aleppo, more than 100 miles away. King Muwatalli, they said, feared the might of Egypt and the young Pharaoh. He had retreated to avoid battle. This was, of course, a lie. The 2 Bedouins were Hittite agents, deliberately planted to be captured and to feed Ramesses false intelligence. And Ramesses believed them. Why would an experienced commander like Ramesses fall for such a ruse? Several factors contributed to his error. First, the information confirmed his expectations and prejudices. Ramesses wanted to believe that the Hittites feared him, that his reputation preceded him. Second, the use of spies disguised as deserters was not yet a common tactic in this period. The Battle of Kadesh may represent one of the earliest recorded uses of such sophisticated deception in ancient warfare. Third, Ramesses was young and perhaps overconfident. He had his father's examples to follow, but lacked his father's experience. Whatever the reason, Ramesses accepted the false intelligence and acted on it. He pushed ahead even more rapidly with the Amun division, widening the gap between his forces. His goal was to reach Kadesh and establish a fortified camp before the other divisions arrived, creating a strong base from which to begin siege operations. This decision would nearly cost him his life and his army. Setting camp, the calm before the storm. Ramesses and the Amun division reached the area northwest of Kadesh without incident. The city lay before them, across the Orontes River. Ramesses ordered his men to establish camp. The Egyptian camp was constructed according to standard procedures. Shields were placed side by side to form a rectangular enclosure, creating a makeshift wall. One entrance was left open, fortified with wooden barricades. 4 divisions of infantry guarded this entrance. In the center of the camp, a large square area was cleared for the royal tent, Ramesses' command post. Smaller tents for officers surrounded it, with the common soldiers' tents arrayed around the perimeter. Ramesses must have felt satisfied. He had reached Kadesh quickly. He had established a strong position. The Re division was approaching from the south and would arrive soon. Once all 4 divisions were assembled, he could begin operations against the city. But then, something happened that would change everything. Egyptian scouts captured 2 more men near the camp. These were not Bedouins, but Hittite soldiers. And unlike the earlier deserters, these men were not cooperative. They had to be persuaded to talk. Ancient Egyptian records are delicate about the methods of persuasion employed, but artwork from the Ramesses' funerary temple, shows the 2 men being beaten with sticks while tied to posts. Whatever the method, it worked. The 2 Hittites revealed the truth. The Hittite army was not far away near Aleppo. It was right here, just behind Kadesh, hidden on the eastern side of the city. Muwatalli had thousands of chariots and tens of thousands of troops ready to strike. Ramesses was shocked. Egyptian accounts describe his reaction in dramatic terms. He immediately summoned his officers and princes to an emergency council, berating them for the failure of their intelligence services. How had they not discovered the Hittite position? How had they allowed him to march into such danger? But Recriminations would have to wait. The immediate priority was survival. Ramesses sent his vizier racing south to contact the Ray division and urge them to hurry. He dispatched messengers to the more distant Ptah and Seth divisions, ordering them to march with all speed to Kadesh, and he ordered the Ammon division to prepare for battle. It was already too late. Part 4. Thunder and blood. The battle unfolds. The hammer falls. Destruction of the Ray division. Even as Ramesses was absorbing the shocking intelligence from the captured Hittite scouts, disaster was already unfolding to the south. The Ray division, under the command of an officer whose name has not survived in the records, was approaching Kadesh along the same route the Ammon division had used. Unlike Ramesses' division, which had reached the Egyptian camp safely, the Ray division was about to walk into a perfectly executed ambush. Muwatalli had timed his attack with precision. He waited until the Ray division was strung out on the march, approaching the camp but not yet close enough to receive immediate support from the Ammon division. The Egyptian soldiers were probably tired from the day's march, not expecting combat, perhaps even looking forward to the rest and food that awaited them in the camp just ahead. Then, with devastating suddenness, approximately 2,500 Hittite chariots exploded from behind Kadesh. The Hittites had forded the Orontes River, moving their chariot force across without being detected by Egyptian scouts. This was a remarkable feat of coordination. Getting thousands of chariots, each pulled by 2 horses and carrying 3 men, across a river quickly and quietly required superb organization and discipline, but Muwatalli's troops managed it. The Hittite chariot force swept around the southern side of Kadesh and struck the Ray division like a thunderbolt. Imagine the scene from the perspective of an Egyptian soldier in the Ray division. You're marching north along a dusty road, perhaps talking with your comrades about the upcoming siege, perhaps thinking about the glory and plunder that success might bring. The Ammon division's camp is visible in the distance. Safety and rest are within sight. And then you hear it. First, a low rumble that you might mistake for thunder, but the sky's clear. The rumbling grows louder, resolving into the unmistakable sound of thousands of hooves and hundreds of chariot wheels. You turn, and your blood turns to ice. A wall of chariots is bearing down on you, raising a cloud of dust that blocks out the sun. Bronze armor glints, spear points gleam. The Hittites are screaming their war cries, a cacophony in a dozen different languages. The earth shakes beneath their charge. You have seconds to react. Do you run? Do you try to form up with your unit? Do you stand and fight? For most of the Ray division, there was no time to organize effective resistance. The Hittite chariot charge smashed into the marching line with devastating force. Hittite chariots, heavier and more stable than their Egyptian counterparts, were designed for precisely this kind of shock attack. The 3-man crews worked in perfect coordination. Drivers guided their vehicles through the chaos. Warriors thrust with their long spears, stabbing at Egyptian soldiers who had no shields raised, no formations established, no preparation. Shield bearers protected their companions while also providing additional weight and stability to the chariot. The Ray division shattered. Egyptian soldiers fled in all directions. Some ran toward the camp, hoping to find safety behind its shield walls. Others scattered into the surrounding countryside, trying to hide or escape the massacre. A few brave souls, probably officers and veteran soldiers, tried to organize some kind of defense, rallying small groups to fight back. But against the massed charge of Hittite chariots, these isolated pockets of resistance were quickly overwhelmed. The slaughter was terrible. Egyptian records later claimed that the Ray division was destroyed in the midst of the march, and while this may be an exaggeration, the division certainly ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Thousands of Egyptian soldiers were killed. More were captured. Equipment, supplies, weapons, chariots, all fell into Hittite hands. But the Hittite attack didn't stop with the destruction of the Ray division. Muwatalli's troops, seeing the Egyptians in full flight, pursued them northward toward Ramesses' camp. This was the moment Muwatalli had planned for. The Egyptian army was divided, one division destroyed, the others troops too far away to help, and Ramesses himself trapped in a partially fortified camp with only the Amun division to defend him. The Battle of Kadesh was about to reach its climax. Assault on the camp. Ramesses and Pharaoh. The fleeing survivors of the Ray division reached the Egyptian camp first, crashing through the entrance in panic. Behind them came the Hittite chariots, their crews hungry for more glory and, critically, eager for plunder. The scene inside the camp quickly descended into chaos. Soldiers from the Ray division, many of them wounded, terrified, and demoralized, streamed through the entrance. Their panic began to infect the Amun division. Some soldiers, seeing the rout and hearing the approach of thousands of Hittite chariots, decided that discretion was the better part of valor and fled. The Hittites hit the camp like a tidal wave. The western side of the Egyptian encampment, where the entrance was located, simply collapsed under the Hittite assault. Shield walls that hadn't been fully erected provided little obstacle to determined attackers. Egyptian soldiers who tried to resist were cut down. The Hittites poured into the camp, their chariots churning up dust and blood. At this point, Ramesses II faced the defining crisis of his life. Egyptian records from the battle, particularly the famous poem of Pentar and the bulletin inscribed on temple walls throughout Egypt, describe what happened next in dramatic, almost mythological terms. While we must account for royal propaganda and literary exaggeration, the basic outline of events seems reliable, corroborated by the fact that Ramesses survived when, by all rights, he should have died. According to Egyptian accounts, Ramesses found himself surrounded and cut off from the bulk of his army. Only his personal household troops remained with him, his closest bodyguards, his chariot driver Mena, and perhaps a few loyal locals. The rest of the Amun division was either fleeing, fighting desperately in scattered groups, or already dead. Ramesses could have fled. As pharaoh, his survival was paramount. Egyptian kingship ideology held that the pharaoh was divine, but it also recognized that even divine kings could lose battles. A tactical retreat to fight another day would have been understandable, perhaps even prudent. But Ramesses didn't flee, whether from courage, desperation, pride, or a combination of all three. He chose to fight. The pharaoh's charge, one man against thousands. What happened next would become the centerpiece of Ramesses' propaganda for the rest of his reign. Depicted on temple walls, from Thebes to Abu Simbel, recounted in poetry that scribes would copy for generations. Ramesses, according to Egyptian accounts, called upon the god Amun for aid. The prayers recorded in the poem of Pentar are remarkably personal and moving, even accounting for literary convention. Ramesses reminds Amun of all the temples he has built, all the offerings he has made, all the devotion he has shown. He asks, is this how the gods reward their faithful servant? Will Amun abandon him to foreign enemies? And then Ramesses charged. With his small band of loyal followers, the young pharaoh counterattacked. His primary weapon was his composite bow, one of the most powerful personal weapons of the Bronze Age. Egyptian artwork showing the battle depicts Ramesses in his chariot, shooting arrows with devastating accuracy, his driver Mena steering them through the chaos while protecting the pharaoh with his shield. Now, we must be careful here. Egyptian accounts claim that Ramesses single-handedly drove back the entire Hittite army. The poem of Pentar describes him making multiple charges through enemy ranks, slaying thousands of Hittites, creating piles of enemy dead. These claims are obvious exaggerations. One man, no matter how skilled, could not defeat an army of thousands. But stripping away the hyperbole, what probably happened is still remarkable. Ramesses, as pharaoh, would have had access to the best equipment available in Egypt. His chariot would have been lighter, faster, and more maneuverable than standard models. His bow would have been a masterpiece of the weapon maker's art. His arrows, probably bronze-tipped and carefully fletched, would have been the finest available. His horses would have been the strongest and best trained in the Egyptian army. More importantly, Ramesses would have undergone extensive military training from childhood. New kingdom pharaohs were expected to be warrior kings. They trained constantly in archery, chariot driving, and combat skills. Ramesses had accompanied his father, Seti I, on campaign, gaining practical battlefield experience. He knew how to fight. So when Ramesses charged, he wasn't just a desperate king making a futile gesture. He was a highly trained warrior in optimal equipment, leading an elite bodyguard, exploiting the confusion and disorder in the Hittite ranks. And the Hittites were in disorder. Here's where the promise of plunder that Muwatalli had made to his troops began to backfire. Many Hittite soldiers, having broken into the Egyptian camp, immediately began looting. Rather than maintaining their formation and completing the destruction of the Egyptian army, they scattered to grab whatever treasure they could find. Egyptian tents were ransacked, supply wagons were plundered. Hittite warriors fought with each other over particularly valuable items. This breakdown in discipline created opportunities that Ramesses exploited. His charges, while they certainly didn't destroy the Hittite army, did cause confusion and casualties. Egyptian arrows found their marks. Hittite officers, trying to restore order, became targets. The panic that had affected the Egyptian forces now began to spread among the Hittites. But Ramesses was still vastly outnumbered and in desperate straits. If the battle had continued with just the forces present, the Hittites would likely have regrouped and overwhelmed him. What Ramesses needed was reinforcements, and they arrived from an unexpected direction. The Nearim arrived, turning the tide. Just when the situation seemed most desperate, fresh Egyptian troops appeared on the battlefield from the north and northwest. These were the Nearim, the mysterious force we discussed earlier. Where exactly they came from remains disputed. Some historians believe they were stationed at the port of Sumer on the Mediterranean coast and had been marching to join Ramesses. Others suggest they might have been part of the Amun division that had been sent ahead as a vanguard or scouting force. Still others propose they were mercenaries or allies who had been approaching from a different route. Whatever their origin, their arrival was perfectly timed. The Nearim force may have numbered around 1,000 troops, including chariots. They weren't enough to defeat the entire Hittite army, but they didn't need to. They simply needed to hit the Hittites at a critical moment when the latter were disorganized and vulnerable. And that's exactly what they did. The Nearim struck the Hittite forces from the north and northwest, an unexpected direction that caused immediate confusion. The Hittites, who thought they had the Egyptians trapped and beaten, suddenly found themselves attacked from their rear or flank. The psychological impact was significant. Had more Egyptian forces arrived? Was this the Ptah division? How many more Egyptians were coming? The combination of Ramesses' stubborn resistance, the disorder caused by looting, and the arrival of the Nearim created a cascade of effects. Hittite units began to fall back. The retreat wasn't a rout. Hittite discipline held well enough to prevent that, but it was a retreat nonetheless. Ramesses, sensing the shift in momentum, pressed his advantage. Egyptian accounts describe him rallying the surviving troops of the Amun division, organizing them into some semblance of order, and launching a coordinated counterattack alongside the Nearim. The Hittites pulled back from the Egyptian camp, withdrawing to regroup. Many Hittite soldiers, encumbered with plunder from the camp, were cut down as they tried to escape. Others drowned, attempting to cross the Orontes River. Egyptian records gleefully describe Hittite nobles and princes drinking water from the river, a euphemism for drowning. But this wasn't a complete Egyptian victory. The Hittites hadn't been routed. They had merely been repulsed. Muwatalli still commanded a huge army. The Ptah and Seth divisions hadn't yet arrived, meaning Ramesses was still outnumbered, and nightfall was approaching. As darkness fell on the first day of the Battle of Kadesh, both armies pulled back to assess the situation and plan for the next day's fighting. Night falls, taking stock. The night after the first day's battle must have been tense for both sides. For the Egyptians, the situation remained precarious. The Ray division had been destroyed as a fighting force. The Amun division had taken significant casualties and seen many troops desert or flee. The camp had been looted and damaged. On the positive side, Ramesses had survived. The Nerin had arrived to bolster Egyptian numbers, and messengers had confirmed that the Ptah division would arrive by morning. The Seth division was also approaching, though it might not arrive until later the next day. For the Hittites, the night brought its own concerns. They had inflicted a devastating blow on the Egyptians, destroying one division and nearly overrunning Ramesses' camp. But they hadn't achieved complete victory. Ramesses lived. The Egyptian army was still in the field, and reinforcements were arriving. The initial surprise and the advantage of the ambush had been expended. Muwatalli faced a critical decision. Should he attack again the next day, trying to finish off the Egyptians before they could fully concentrate their forces? Or should he adopt a more defensive posture, having already dealt the Egyptians a serious blow? According to Egyptian records, Muwatalli sent envoys to Ramesses during the night, proposing peace. Ramesses, demonstrating considerable bravado, reportedly refused, claiming that he would destroy the Hittite army the next day.
Will be ours,
Whether this
and
exchange
Egypt's
actually
glory
occurred
will
is
shine
uncertain.
forevermore.
It appears in Egyptian propaganda texts, which are not always reliable for such details, but it's plausible. Both sides had reasons to avoid further battle. The Egyptians had been badly mauled and were still outnumbered. The Hittites had achieved their primary objective of defending Kadesh and had inflicted serious losses on the invaders. But if peace overtures were made, they came to nothing. The next day, both armies prepared for renewed combat. Day 2, the battle continues. Dawn broke on the second day of the Battle of Kadesh to find both armies preparing for combat. The Ptah division had arrived during the night or early morning, significantly reinforcing the Egyptian position. Ramesses now had the survivors of the Ammon division, the fresh Ptah division, and the Nearin force, giving him perhaps 12 to 15,000 effective troops and around 1,500 chariots. The Seth division was still approaching and would arrive later in the day. Muwatalli still commanded his enormous coalition army, though he had taken casualties on the previous day. His chariot force remained formidable, probably still numbering over 2,000 vehicles. The second day's fighting was very different from the first day's ambush and assault. Both sides deployed in more formal battle arrays. The Egyptians had learned from their mistakes. There would be no more strung-out marches vulnerable to ambush. The Hittites couldn't rely on surprise. The Egyptians knew exactly where they were and were prepared. What followed was a brutal slaughter match, the kind of attritional combat that Bronze Age armies generally tried to avoid because it was so costly for both sides. Chariot forces clashed repeatedly. Egyptian chariots, lighter and faster, attempted to harass Hittite formations with mobile archery. Hittite chariots, heavier and more stable, tried to close for decisive shot charges with their spears. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Infantry formations engaged in pushing trenches, spear blades trying to break enemy lines. Archers from both sides rained arrows on enemy formations. The battlefield became a confused melee of struggling warriors, dying horses, broken chariots, and scattered equipment. Egyptian sources claim that Ramesses personally led multiple charges, rallying his troops and demonstrating the courage expected of a pharaoh. While we can't verify specific details, it's clear that Ramesses didn't hide in his tent. New Kingdom pharaohs were expected to fight alongside their troops, and Ramesses lived up to this expectation. As the day wore on and casualties mounted on both sides, the Seth division finally arrived, further reinforcing the Egyptian position. Ramesses now had 3 of his 4 divisions on the battlefield, the Re division being too shattered to fight effectively, giving him rough numerical parity with the Hittites. The battle had reached a stalemate. The Butcher's Bill. Results of the battle. As the second day of combat drew to a close, both sides pulled back. The fighting had been fierce and casualties heavy, but neither side had achieved a decisive victory. Egyptian records claim a great triumph. Temple inscriptions describe Ramesses as victorious, returning to Egypt in glory, having defeated the Hittite army and captured numerous prisoners. The poem of Pentor describes Hittite kings bowing before Ramesses, acknowledging Egyptian supremacy. These claims are propaganda, pure and simple. In reality, The Battle of Kadesh ended in a tactical draw, arguably with a slight advantage to the Hittites. Ramesses had marched north with the objective of capturing Kadesh. He failed to do so. The Re division had been destroyed. The other divisions had taken heavy casualties. Ramesses' campaign had not achieved its strategic objective. On the other hand, Ramesses and the Egyptian army had survived what should have been a catastrophic defeat. Against all odds, the young pharaoh had escaped Muwatalli's trap. The Egyptian army, though battered, was still in the field, and Ramesses had demonstrated personal courage that won him the respect of his troops. From the Hittite perspective, Muwatalli had successfully defended Kadesh. The Egyptian invasion had been repulsed. The city remained in Hittite hands. Egyptian casualties had been severe. By these measures, Muwatalli had won. But the Hittites had also failed to destroy the Egyptian army when they had the chance. Ramesses' escape meant that he would return to Egypt, raise new armies, and potentially threaten Kadesh again. The coalition army Muwatalli had assembled at such great expense had achieved a defensive success, but not the decisive victory that would have permanently eliminated the Egyptian threat. Moreover, the battle had been costly for the Hittites as well. Casualties among the chariot forces had been particularly heavy. Several Hittite princes and nobles had been killed, drowning in the Orontes or falling to Egyptian arrows. These losses weakened the Hittite political structure and created succession issues that would plague the empire in subsequent years. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Kadesh demonstrated to both sides that neither could achieve a decisive military victory over the other. Egypt and the Hittites were too evenly matched. Continued warfare would only bleed both empires without resolving the fundamental strategic stalemate. This realization would eventually lead to one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of the ancient world. Part 5. Aftermath. From battle to peace. The retreat and the spin. After the second day of fighting at Kadesh, Ramesses made the prudent decision to withdraw. His army had suffered heavy casualties, his supply lines were tenuous, and he lacked the strength to besiege the heavily fortified city. The Egyptian army retreated southward, back toward Egyptian-controlled territory. Muwatalli, perhaps recognizing that his own army had also been severely weakened, did not pursue aggressively. The Hittites were content to have defended their territory successfully. Ramesses' return to Egypt must have been a somber affair, very different from the triumphant homecoming he had envisioned when he set out for Kadesh. He had not captured the city. He had not crushed the Hittite army. One of his 4 divisions had been destroyed. Any objective analysis would conclude that the campaign had been a failure. But Ramesses II was a master of propaganda,
before me,
and he was not about to let a little thing
My
like
majesty
military
alone
reality
secured this
interfere
victory.
with his public image. Upon returning to Egypt, Ramesses launched perhaps the most extensive propaganda campaign in ancient history. He commissioned scribes to compose epic poems about the battle. He ordered artists to create massive relief sculptures depicting his triumph. He had the story inscribed on the walls of temples throughout Egypt, at Karnak, Luxor, the Ramesseum, Abu Simbel, and other sites. These inscriptions presented the Battle of Kadesh as a great Egyptian victory. They portrayed Ramesses as a heroic warrior king who, abandoned by cowardly troops, single-handedly defeated the entire Hittite army with the help of the god Amun. They claimed that Muwatalli sent envoys begging for peace. They listed thousands of Hittite casualties and hundreds of captured princes. Modern historians must navigate these sources carefully, separating historical fact from royal propaganda. But we shouldn't dismiss the Egyptian records entirely. While they exaggerate Ramesses' success and minimize Egyptian losses, they also contain valuable, accurate details about the battle's course, the units involved, and the tactics employed. The poem of Pentor, despite its obvious bias, remains our most detailed narrative source for the battle. The Bulletin, a more prosaic account also inscribed on temple walls, provides additional details. And the visual reliefs, while stylized and propagandistic, show actual chariot designs, troop formations, and tactical situations that align with what we know from other sources about Bronze Age warfare. What's most remarkable about Ramesses' propaganda campaign is how successful it was. For the rest of his reign, an impressive 67 years, Ramesses presented himself as the victor of Kadesh, the pharaoh who crushed Egypt's enemies through personal valor. Later, pharaohs would invoke the memory of the Battle of Kadesh as Egypt's greatest triumph. Schoolboys, learning to be scribes, would copy the poem of repentance as a writing exercise. Ramesses had lost the battle but won the propaganda war. Continued conflict. The war drags on. Despite Ramesses' propaganda presenting Kadesh as a decisive victory, the reality was that the conflict between Egypt and the Hittites continued for years after 1274 BCE. Ramesses launched additional campaigns into Syria and Canaan in the years following Kadesh, attempting to expand Egyptian influence and recapture territories that had switched allegiance to the Hittites. These campaigns met with mixed success. Ramesses captured some cities, but he could not break Hittite control over northern Syria, and Kadesh remained firmly in Hittite hands. Meanwhile, the Hittite Empire faced its own challenges. Muwatalli's brother, Hattusili III, who had commanded part of the Hittite forces at Kadesh, became involved in a succession dispute after Muwatalli's death around 1272 BCE. Muwatalli was succeeded by his son Mursili III, but Hattusili III overthrew his nephew in a coup around 1267 BCE and claimed the throne for himself. This internal Hittite conflict created an opportunity for Egypt, but Ramesses was unable to exploit it decisively. The strategic stalemate continued. Egypt controlled southern Canaan and parts of coastal Syria. The Hittites controlled northern Syria and Anatolia. The border region, particularly around cities like Amurru and Kadesh, remained contested. Both empires were also facing external pressures. Egypt confronted threats from Libyan tribes to the west and increasing instability in Nubia to the south. The Hittites faced constant raids from the Kaska tribes in northern Anatolia and growing Assyrian power in Mesopotamia. Neither empire could afford to devote unlimited resources to their conflict with each other. The continuing warfare was draining both treasuries and preventing both kingdoms from addressing other threats. Moreover, diplomatic communications between the two powers suggest that both sides recognize the futility of continued conflict. Letters between Egyptian and Hittite courts show a gradual shift in tone from hostility to grudging respect and eventually to serious peace negotiations. The turning point came in the 1262 BCE, when both Ramesses and Hattusili III realized that they had more to gain from peace than from continued warfare. The treaty, Peace Between Empires. In 1259 or 1258 BCE, approximately 15 years after the Battle of Kadesh, Egypt and the Hittite Empire concluded a formal peace treaty. This Treaty of Kadesh, as it's known to historians, was revolutionary for its time. It represents the earliest known example of an international peace treaty between two equal powers, and remarkably, copies of it have survived in both Egyptian and Hittite versions. The Egyptian version is inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Amun at Karnak and at the Ramesseum. It's written in Egyptian hieroglyphics, translated from an Akkadian text. The Hittite version, written in Akkadian cuneiform, was discovered among the archives at Hattusa, the Hittite capital. The existence of both versions, each in the other's language, demonstrates the sophisticated diplomatic practices of the late Bronze Age. The treaty contained several key provisions. First, it established a mutual non-aggression pact. Neither side would attack the other's territory. Any previous conflicts or grievances were set aside. This was formalized with oaths sworn before both Egyptian and Hittite gods, giving the treaty religious sanction that both sides took seriously. Second, the treaty included a mutual defense clause. If either empire was attacked by a third party, the other would provide military assistance. This was particularly important for the Hittites, who faced threats from Assyria, and for Egypt, which dealt with Libyan incursions. Third, the treaty addressed the issue of political refugees. If subjects of either empire fled to the other kingdom, they would be extradited. This prevented disgruntled nobles or rebels from finding sanctuary in the rival empire, which would have been a constant source of tension. Fourth, the treaty established a succession guarantee. Each power agreed to support the legitimate heirs of the other's throne, preventing external interference in succession crises. This was personally important for both Ramesses and Hattusili, who wanted to ensure smooth successions for their sons. The treaty's language is fascinating. Both versions emphasized that the agreement was made between equals, the great king of Egypt and the great king of Hatti. This was significant in an age when most treaties were between a superior power and an inferior vassal. Egypt and the Hittites acknowledged each other as peers, neither superior to the other. The treaty invoked numerous gods from both pantheons as witnesses and enforcers. Egyptian deities like Ra, Seth, and Amun were listed alongside Hittite gods like the storm god and the sun goddess of Arena. If either side violated the treaty, these gods would punish the offender. This religious dimension gave the treaty a binding force that purely secular agreements would have lacked in the Bronze Age worldview. What's also remarkable is the treaty's durability. Unlike many ancient peace agreements that collapsed as soon as circumstances changed, the Treaty of Kadesh held for the remainder of both empires' existence. Egypt and the Hittites never fought each other again after 1259 BCE. For over 70 years, until the collapse of the Hittite Empire around 1180 BCE during the Bronze Age collapse, the treaty remained in force. The peace was cemented through additional diplomatic exchanges. Ramesses II eventually married at least 2 Hittite princesses, daughters of Hattusili III, further strengthening the alliance. These marriages were celebrated with great fanfare, commemorated in Egyptian inscriptions that describe the Hittite princess arriving with a vast dowry and being welcomed as a great queen of Egypt. Correspondence between the courts became frequent and friendly. Letters between Ramesses and Hattusili addressed each other as brother, the standard diplomatic language for equal rulers. The queens of both empires exchanged letters as well, discussing various matters and maintaining the personal relationships that supported the diplomatic alliance. The Treaty of Kadesh is so significant that in 1963, a replica of it was hung in the United Nations headquarters in New York as a symbol of the possibilities of peace and international cooperation. The fact that a Bronze Age treaty from over 3,000 years ago is still invoked as an example of successful diplomacy speaks to its historical importance and its enduring relevance.